My friends, let me tell you a story. A preacher once stood on the stage of life with nothing but courage in his heart. He was not rich, he was not powerful, but he was bold. He dared to speak words that most people would never say. And because of this, he became dangerous to the lie that had been living inside the walls of the church. He said something that shook everyone. Faith is not about buildings, not about titles, not about money. Faith is about truth, about action, about love. But many people didn't want to hear it. Because if they believed it, they would have to change. They would have to stop pretending, stop following rituals blindly, and start living with honesty. When he died, people cried. They said, "What a loss." But his death was not the end. In fact, it was the beginning. Because when a bold man dies, his voice becomes louder than ever. The truth he exposed cannot be buried. It lives on like fire, spreading from heart to heart. The biggest lie in the church was not about religion itself. It was about control. It was about convincing people that holiness comes from outside, from candles, from robes, from ceremonies. But the preacher showed us that holiness comes from inside, from how you treat your neighbor, from how you spend your money, from how you forgive, from how you love. Now, why does this shock people? Because truth is uncomfortable. Lies are easy. Lies make people feel safe. But truth makes people restless. Truth forces people to move. That is why bold voices are rare. That is why the world remembers when they are gone. So, what can we learn from him? Don't wait for someone else to tell you the truth. Don't wait for the preacher to rise again. Be bold in your own life. Expose the lies around you. In your work, in your family, in your society. Speak the truth, even if it costs you. Because one day, you too will die. And the question is not whether you lived long, but whether you lived bold. The story of the bold preacher begins with his courage, a quality that separated him from the rest of the crowd. He was not the most educated. He was not the most famous. And he was not backed by wealth or influence. But he had something rarer than all of these. The audacity to stand up and speak when everyone else chose silence. Courage is not simply the absence of fear. It is the decision to move forward despite fear. This man understood that truth is not always convenient. And sometimes it puts you directly against systems, traditions, and people who have built their comfort around lies. Yet, instead of avoiding that conflict, he embraced it. He stood in front of communities, leaders, and even those who mocked him and declared what others only whispered about in secret. His courage was not reckless. It was purposeful. He knew that exposing deception would come at a price. He knew that many would hate him, criticize him, or even try to silence him. But for him, silence was a greater enemy than any opposition he could face. He believed that one bold voice is more powerful than 1,000 silent ones, and so he chose to be that voice. This bravery did not come from arrogance. It came from conviction, from the deep belief that living in truth is better than living in safety. People often admire courage when they see it, but they forget how costly it truly is. For this preacher, every speech, every word was an act of defiance against the comfort of lies, and with each act, he risked not just his reputation, but his very life. What made his courage even more remarkable was that it was not driven by selfish ambition. He did not seek recognition or applause. His strength came from a desire to serve people, to free them from illusions, to wake them up from the slumber of blind faith and guide them towards something real. Courage, in its truest form, is not about fighting for oneself, but about fighting for the good of others. That is what made his boldness shine so brightly. He gave people permission to question, to think, to break the chains of fear that had held them down for so long. In the end, the courage of the preacher was a mirror for everyone else. It showed that the ability to speak the truth exists in all of us, but very few choose to use it. He reminded the world that courage is not reserved for heroes or saints, but for anyone who decides that truth is more valuable than comfort, and that silence in the face of lies is the greatest betrayal of all. True faith has always been misunderstood by many because people often confuse external rituals with inner transformation. The bold preacher who stood against this illusion reminded everyone that real faith does not live in tall buildings, decorated altars, or expensive ceremonies. These things may give an impression of holiness, but they cannot create it. True faith, he declared, is found in the way a person treats others, the honesty with which one conducts business, the humility with which one speaks, and the love one shows in daily life. His words cut deep because they stripped away the false layers people had comfortably accepted. Many wanted to believe that by simply attending services, donating money, or following traditions blindly, they had done enough. But the preacher's message was clear: faith without love, faith without action, faith without truth is nothing but an empty shell. He challenged the idea that religious titles or positions made someone closer to God. According to him, wearing special clothes or standing at the front of a congregation meant nothing if the heart was full of pride and deceit. He said that it is easy to impress people with rituals, but it is much harder to live in kindness, forgiveness, and compassion. This difference between appearance and reality was the foundation of his teaching, and it was also the reason why so many resisted him. Because if his words were true, then many leaders and followers alike would have to confront their hypocrisy. The preacher painted faith as something living and active. It is not measured by how many prayers are repeated, but by how those prayers shape the life of the one who prays. If prayers do not make someone more loving, more just, and more forgiving, then they are nothing more than noise. He gave examples of ordinary people who showed greater faith through small acts of sacrifice and service than those who performed grand rituals for recognition. This was shocking to many, but it was also liberating. For the first time, people realized that they did not need to buy holiness or depend on rituals to be close to the truth. His message reminded everyone that faith is not about looking upward alone, but also about looking around. How you treat your neighbor, how you share your wealth, how you respond to those who hurt you. These are the true signs of faith. It is easy to hide behind rituals, but it takes courage and sincerity to live by values that demand love, justice, and truth in every action. When the bold preacher passed away, many thought his influence would fade with him, but instead his voice grew louder. Death has a strange way of magnifying the message of those who lived with conviction. People often ignore the living because they are uncomfortable with the truth being spoken in the present. But once the voice is silenced by death, it begins to echo in ways no one can control. The preacher's words, once resisted and mocked, started to spread like wildfire after his passing. His courage became legendary, and those who once dismissed him now began to repeat the very truths he had risked everything to share. The power of death did not bury his message, it amplified it. The preacher's death reminded people that truth cannot be chained. You can silence a person, but you cannot silence the reality they stood for. The lie that had been protected for so long within the walls of the church suddenly became fragile. His absence forced people to confront his presence. They recalled his sermons, his warnings, his insistence that faith must be lived out honestly. Those words began to weigh heavier in their hearts because now they carried the strength of legacy. Death had turned his truth into something sacred, something that could not be ignored any longer. There is a strange fear in institutions when a bold man dies. While alive, they can argue with him, discredit him, or try to isolate him. But once he is gone, the power shifts. His story becomes untouchable. His sacrifice becomes undeniable, and his courage becomes an inspiration. The very system that tried to bury him ends up unintentionally spreading his message because people whisper and wonder if he was willing to die for this truth. Perhaps it was worth listening to. His death became the seal of authenticity on everything he had said. The impact of his death was not just emotional, it was transformational. Ordinary people began to question the things they had once accepted blindly. They started to reflect on whether their faith was built on rituals or on reality. Leaders who had been comfortable in their positions now faced a restless crowd hungry for answers. The silence of the preacher's grave became louder than his living voice. It reminded everyone that a bold man may die, but his truth will continue to rise, carried forward by those who finally wake up to the reality he gave his life to reveal the greatest revelation that shook people after the preacher's passing was his fearless exposure of the biggest lie within the church. For years, people had been led to believe that faith could be measured by outward appearances, by how much money was given, by how perfectly rituals were performed, or by how devotedly one followed traditions. Leaders used this lie as a tool of control, keeping people bound in fear and guilt, convincing them that holiness was something they had to buy or earn through external actions. The preacher stood firmly against this deception and declared that true holiness cannot be bought, cannot be manufactured, and cannot be measured by the standards of men. It is something internal, born from sincerity, humility, and love that flows from the heart into everyday actions. This was not an easy truth for people to accept because it exposed the comfort of hiding behind rituals. Many found safety in believing that attending services or donating money was enough to cover their flaws. The preacher destroyed that illusion. He said that you cannot bribe truth and you cannot decorate a lie and make it holy. He emphasized that true faith transforms a person from the inside out, changing how they speak, how they act, and how they treat others. The lie of the church was not about religion itself, but about creating a system where appearances mattered more than reality. And this system had blinded people to the deeper, more demanding work of genuine transformation. His exposure of this lie was both liberating and frightening. It was liberating because it told ordinary people that they didn't need wealth, high status, or special privileges to be close to truth. It was frightening because it forced them to realize that they could no longer hide behind shallow practices. They had to confront their own hearts and ask hard questions. Am I living with love? Am I forgiving those who hurt me? Am I walking honestly in my daily life? These questions demanded courage, and not everyone was ready for them. The preacher made it clear that the biggest lie was not about God, but about man's misuse of God's name. By exposing this, he broke chains of control and gave people permission to search for something real. His message was a call to shift from empty appearances to authentic living, from being trapped in the image of faith to embracing the reality of it in every choice, every word, and every action. Lies have always been easier to accept than truth because lies offer comfort while truth demands change. The preacher made this contrast crystal clear when he spoke, and it was one of the reasons his words shook so many people. Lies make life simple. You do what you are told, you follow the surface rules, and you never question. They give people the illusion of safety because they do not require effort or reflection. Truth, on the other hand, is uncomfortable. It makes people restless because it calls them to confront their weaknesses, their hypocrisy, and their hidden fears. The preacher often said that truth is like a mirror, and mirrors are not always kind, but they are always honest. He explained that lies had been dressed up so beautifully that people started calling them traditions and rituals. These traditions were easy because they demanded no sacrifice of the heart. Anyone could go through the motions without ever truly changing. But truth asks for transformation, and transformation is painful. It requires letting go of pride, forgiving those who have wronged us, choosing honesty when lies seem easier, and living with love even when it is costly. This is why many resisted the preacher's message, because deep down, they knew it would disrupt their comfortable lives. The preacher highlighted how lies protect the ego while truth destroys it. Lies make people feel good about themselves without actually making them better. Truth, however, challenges the ego and forces growth. That is why people fight against truth, not because it is wrong, but because it is hard. His courage in pointing this out made him stand out, for very few are willing to put themselves in conflict with what the majority believes. He reminded people that comfort is the enemy of growth, and lies feed comfort while truth fuels progress. By drawing this sharp line between truth and lies, he forced people to see what they had been avoiding. Some hated him for it, but others were awakened. For the first time, many began to realize that following lies only leads to emptiness, while embracing truth, though difficult, brings freedom. His teaching became a wake-up call that lies can make life easier in the short term, but in the long run, only truth can set a soul free and give meaning to existence. Bold voices are rare in every generation, and that is why they are remembered long after they are gone. The preacher stood out not because he was the loudest, but because he was willing to say what others avoided. Most people choose silence when they see lies, because silence feels safe, it avoids conflict, and it protects reputation. But bold voices refuse to stay silent, even if it costs them everything. The preacher's strength came from his refusal to trade truth for comfort. He understood that speaking out would bring criticism, rejection, and even danger, but he also knew that silence would make him complicit in the very lies he despised. This rare willingness to sacrifice comfort for conviction gave his words power that ordinary voices lacked. His boldness did not come from anger or arrogance, but from clarity. He had a vision of what faith was meant to be and could not accept the distorted version that had been presented for so long. When a person speaks with such conviction, their words carry a weight that cuts through excuses and pretenses. That is why people who heard him, whether they loved him or hated him, could never forget him. Boldness makes a voice unforgettable because it is tied to truth, and truth has a way of living in people's hearts even when they try to resist it. Throughout history, it is always the bold voices that shape change. The preacher became part of that tradition, showing that courage can move people more than authority or wealth ever could. His boldness was not just about exposing lies. It was about inspiring others to question, to think, and to rise. People may not have agreed with everything he said, but they could not deny the strength with which he said it. That strength became a seed planted in the minds of his listeners, a seed that continued to grow even after he was gone. What made him unforgettable was that his voice was not merely for himself. It was for the people who were trapped by deception. He gave them words when they had none, courage when they felt powerless, and truth when they were surrounded by illusions. This is why bold voices remain in history. They awaken others to their own strength and show that one person's bravery can echo across generations, leaving an impact that cannot be erased. The preacher's message was never meant to be kept within the walls of the church or limited to his own voice. His intention was to hand the responsibility of truth over to everyone who heard him. He made it clear that boldness is not a gift reserved for a chosen few. It is a choice available to anyone willing to pay the price. He challenged people to stop waiting for leaders, prophets, or preachers to tell them what is right and instead live the truth themselves. His call to action was simple yet powerful. Expose lies wherever you see them, whether in your family, your work, or your society, and live in a way that reflects honesty and integrity. He believed that every individual carried the power to influence the world around them if they dared to act with courage. He often reminded people that truth is not only spoken from pulpits, it is lived out in daily choices. When you refuse to cheat in business, when you speak kindly to someone who cannot repay you, when you stand against injustice, even if you stand alone, these are acts of boldness. They may not make headlines, but they change lives. The preacher knew that if ordinary people embraced this way of living, the ripple effect would transform communities more powerfully than any sermon could. His message was that boldness is not about shouting louder than others. It is about refusing to compromise on what is right, no matter the cost. This call to action frightened some because it removed excuses. It meant people could no longer hide behind the idea that change was someone else's responsibility. It forced them to realize that silence in the face of lies makes them part of the problem. By urging everyone to be bold in their own life, the preacher shifted the focus from passive faith to active living. This was not a comfortable message, but it was a necessary one. The preacher's words live on because they did not depend on him alone. They demanded something from everyone who listened. He reminded people that boldness does not begin with grand speeches, but with small, consistent choices to live in truth. His call was for each person to stop waiting for heroes and instead become one in their own circle, to carry the torch of honesty, to break chains of fear, and to prove that living boldly is not only possible, but essential for a life of true faith. The preacher's life taught that the true measure of a person is not how long they live, but how boldly and truthfully they live. Many people spend their years chasing safety, comfort, and acceptance, believing that if they can avoid trouble and live quietly, they will have lived well. But the preacher showed the opposite. His time on earth was not defined by the number of days he survived, but by the impact of the truth he carried. He did not seek longevity, he sought legacy. Every time he spoke, he risked being silenced, but he also knew that each word of truth planted a seed that would outlive him. In this way, his short time carried more weight than the long lives of those who remained silent. Legacy, he believed, is born from boldness. When someone chooses truth over lies, love over hatred, and justice over corruption, they create ripples that travel far beyond their own lifetime. The preacher's courage became a spark that ignited others, and that spark continues to burn even after his death. People remember those who live boldly because they give the world something rare, authenticity. They remind us of what life is truly meant to be. Without such voices, the world becomes dull, filled with people who live long but leave no mark. His message was a reminder that a bold life, no matter how brief, has the power to echo across generations. The preacher also made people understand that death is inevitable for everyone, but not everyone truly lives before they die. To exist is not the same as to live. To live is to step into truth, to risk something for what matters, and to use your days to bring light into dark places. Those who live in fear may stretch their years, but their lives remain empty. Those who live in boldness may face danger, but their lives overflow with meaning. This contrast shook his followers because it forced them to ask, what will people remember about me when I am gone? The lesson was clear. The worth of a life is not in its length, but in its depth. The preacher's legacy became proof that one courageous life, lived with honesty and conviction, is worth more than 100 years of silent conformity. He showed that boldness and truth are the real measures of greatness, and that every person must decide whether they will simply exist or whether they will live in a way that cannot be forgotten. My friends, the story of the bold preacher is not just about a man who lived and died. It is about a truth that cannot be silenced. He showed us that courage is stronger than fear, that faith is deeper than rituals, and that truth is more powerful than lies. His voice may no longer be heard, but his message now belongs to us. The question is no longer what he exposed, but what we will do with it. Will we hide behind comfort, or will we rise with boldness? Will we allow lies to control us, or will we dare to live with truth? His life reminds us that the greatest legacy is not in wealth, fame, or titles, but in the courage to stand for what is right. Let us carry that legacy forward, not just in words, but in action, so that our lives, too, may shine with the same boldness that made his unforgettable,